Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
My husband James had been gone for only 3 months when I realized that the house felt more like a mausoleum than a home, and the silence inside its walls pressed down on me so hard that sometimes I would turn on the television just for the background noise of strangers arguing on talk shows. He was overseas, serving in a place he could never fully describe in his letters, and every word he sent me was laced with longing, apology, and that kind of optimism men carry when they want to reassure everyone back home that they are still the same person, even while waking up each morning to the sound of gunfire. His letters smelled faintly of the sand he could never shake off his uniform, and I would fold them over and over again until the creases cut the paper into strips. But even that didn't fill the space beside me at night where he used to sleep. Ryan, his younger brother, knew exactly when to show up. He had this habit of knocking only once, then letting himself in like the place belonged to him, and he would call out, "Hey, sis," in that lazy drawl of his, as though we had some kind of unspoken agreement that he could just stroll in whenever he wanted. At first I thought he was trying to be helpful, maybe even protective, because James wasn't around and someone had to check on me, or at least that's what he told himself when he plopped down at my kitchen table and asked what was for dinner. I laughed it off, cooked him meals I wasn't even hungry enough to eat, and told myself it was better than talking to the walls. But loneliness has a sharp edge, and it doesn't just cut once. It keeps slicing day after day until you don't even realize you're bleeding out. Ryan filled that void in ways that at first seemed innocent. He carried the heavy bags of dog food in from the car. He fixed the leaky faucet James had meant to repair before leaving. And he sat with me on evenings when the sound of the wind rattling the windows made me nervous. It should have ended there. I should have drawn the line when he leaned in too close while reaching for the salt, or when his eyes lingered just a beat too long on the neckline of my shirt. Instead, I convinced myself it was harmless, that he was just being a flirt because that was his nature, and that I was strong enough to ignore it. The night everything shifted, I had opened a bottle of wine, telling myself I'd only pour one glass to ease the tension that lived in my chest like a permanent knot. Ryan appeared at the door again, grinning like he had been waiting for me to open it, and he asked what we were celebrating. I told him nothing, just surviving another day, and he raised his eyebrows like that was an invitation. We sat at the table, drinking more than either of us needed, and the conversation drifted from trivial things, sports, the neighbors, even a silly argument about which pizza chain was better, to James. And when Ryan started talking about how James always got the spotlight, how their parents praised him for every achievement while dismissing Ryan as the family screw-up, I should have stopped him. I should have defended James, but instead I just listened, because in that moment I understood what it felt like to live in someone else's shadow. When Ryan leaned forward, his breath warm with wine, and said that James didn't deserve me because he had abandoned me for a war on the other side of the world, I felt a flash of anger, but it was drowned out by something I hated to recognize: relief. Relief that someone saw me, even in the most twisted way possible. I told myself it was just a mistake when his lips brushed mine, that I would push him away, that it would end before it even began. But mistakes have a way of multiplying, and once one is made, the rest follow like dominoes tipping in slow motion. The guilt was immediate and suffocating, but Ryan acted as though nothing was wrong. He strutted around the kitchen like he had won something, smirking when he picked up James's favorite mug and drank coffee from it the next morning as though marking territory. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him this wasn't what I wanted, but the words lodged in my throat because a part of me was terrified of what it meant if I admitted the truth. And then came the worst part. James's letter arrived the very same afternoon, folded neatly, his handwriting a little shaky but still filled with love. He wrote about how he couldn't wait to come home, how he missed the smell of my shampoo on his pillow, how the only thing that kept him going was the thought of me waiting. I sat at the table, the ink blurring as tears smudged the words, and across from me Ryan watched in silence, his eyes daring me to tell him that the future James pictured was already shattered. That was the first time I realized Ryan didn't just want me. He wanted to take James's life, his place, his everything, and he wasn't planning to let go. And as I folded the letter and tucked it back into its envelope, I knew that what had begun as a single lapse in judgment was already spiraling into something that would burn down the entire family. I just didn't know yet how far he was willing to go, or how much I would lose before it was over. The morning after that letter with the sand-dry handwriting arrived, I woke with the kind of hangover that had nothing to do with wine and everything to do with the dull throb of shame that settles behind the eyes when you realize a line has been crossed and that stepping back over it will not clean the footprints you left. And I moved through the kitchen like a houseguest in my own life, washing James's mug, straightening the tired dish towel, and pretending the faint smell of his aftershave still lived in the air because I needed one familiar thing that did not argue with me. James had written again, a shorter note this time, saying mail was unpredictable and the weather worse, that he was counting sunsets to measure the distance until he could come home. And I reread it while Ryan slouched in the doorway with that smug expression he wore like a leather jacket, telling me he would grill on the porch later if I picked up steaks because he had a coupon, as if the universe had appointed him my budget-conscious caretaker. His parents, my in-laws, were back to hosting their gentle pageants of selective memory, where James became a polite topic for the part of the evening that required patriotism and Ryan took the spotlight for the rest. And when Carol called to remind me about Sunday dinner, she added in that breezy tone that passed for kindness that it might be good for me to bring dessert since Ryan had been such a help lately, mowing the lawn, checking on the gutters, and being, in her wording, the kind of dependable you only see in sons who stay close to home, which was the moment I bit my tongue so hard I tasted iron and said I would bring a pie. Ryan heard the call, of course, because he always heard everything, and he winked in that maddening way that made me want to throw something heavy, then launched into a speech about how families adapt, how James would understand that needs change and life is short and no one can be expected to wait forever, a sermon he delivered while drinking coffee from the same mug my husband had held on the morning he left. I told myself to be rational, to refuse the he said she said roller coaster that makes people throw up their dignity, and I tried to steady my hands by cleaning out the junk drawer, that archaeological dig of batteries that may or may not work, rubber bands that have lost their elasticity, and takeout menus from restaurants that quietly closed, and under a stack of coupons I found the old tablet we kept in the kitchen for recipes and streaming long baking videos when I couldn't sleep. Ryan had used it the week before to look up a part number for the faucet, and, because the universe likes poetic irony, his messages were still signed in, a bright blue bubble chorus that lit the screen with a group chat titled Backyard Kings, where he wrote with the kind of braggadocio men save for locker rooms and bar stools, telling his friends he had finally outplayed his big brother, that I was practically living at his place in spirit already, and that by the time James came home the family would understand how grown-ups handled things when passion knocks, which would have been laughable if it hadn't been so ruinous. I stared at those messages for a long stretch of minutes, hearing the refrigerator hum and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, and I felt something in me harden into a shape I recognized from long ago, from the days before James, when self-respect was less a polite virtue and more a survival skill, and while I will not pretend I became a saint overnight, I also will not pretend I let Ryan keep his hands on the steering wheel. He had a not-quite girlfriend named Lauren, the kind of woman who keeps her standards inside a spine of steel and her patience in a jar with a tight lid, and, because I am not as stupid as grief tries to make me, I took screenshots of the worst lines. The ones where he talked about replacing his brother like a used tire, the ones where he rated my body like a menu item, and I sent them to her from a clean account with a short note that said only that a woman deserved to know who shared her bed. It did not take long. That same evening, while Ryan was on my porch flipping steaks and brainstorming how we would roll out the news, like we were launching a product, Lauren arrived in jeans and a calm fury that could have cooled the grill, and she asked him to hand her his phone, which he did with the confused confidence of a man who thinks charm is a universal currency, and she scrolled for what felt like an hour though it was only minutes, then looked up at me with a nod that said thank you without admitting anything, and she told Ryan he could keep his coupons because she was done subsidizing his ego. He sputtered, tried to fold me into his defense like a witness for the prosecution who had suddenly switched sides, and when that failed he muttered that this was a misunderstanding that adults could fix privately. A phrase I repeated back to him with a smile as I took the spare key off his keyring and dropped it into my pocket with a click that sounded, to me at least, like the first small door closing on a long hallway of bad choices. That was not mercy, and it was not justice, but it was a start, and if revenge tasted like slightly overcooked steak and the sound of a man realizing he had misread the room, I swallowed it gladly. Then washed the plates and canceled Sunday dessert with a text that said I would not make it because I was feeling under the weather, which was true if you count a sudden allergy to hypocrisy as a seasonal illness. Later, when the sky went the color of old brews and the porch light drew moths to the screen, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. And the voice on the other end introduced himself as someone from James's unit who needed to verify our address for a possible early stateside leave. A routine call, he said. Nothing guaranteed, just logistics. Yet the room tilted a few degrees as I wrote down the callback information, because if James was coming home sooner than expected, then the small revenge I had just served would be a firecracker compared to the explosion waiting in our living room, and I realized that I had no plan for the moment when the man I loved walked through the door and saw the ash on the floor that looked suspiciously like trust. He came home on a gray afternoon that smelled like wet concrete and cut grass, the kind of weather that makes every porch step creak louder, and when I saw James on the walkway in the jacket I had not washed since the day he left, my lungs forgot how to behave and my body did that contradictory thing where it wanted to run toward him and hide behind the nearest piece of furniture at the same time, because love and dread can share the same rib cage without ever shaking hands. He looked thinner, but steadier, the way men look when they are carrying stories they will not yet tell, and he smiled with that tired gentleness that always made me feel like the world could be negotiated if we just took our time and spoke softly enough. Yet the moment he crossed the threshold his eyes did the quick inventory that soldiers do, the scan for absence and presence, and I watched him register the rearranged knife block, the missing sweatshirt that used to live on the back of the chair, the scent of a cologne that did not belong to him no matter how many times I had attacked it with orange cleaner and open windows. We made tea we did not drink and performed a mime show of normal marriage, asking about flights and layovers and who watered the plants, and the more I smiled the more my cheeks began to ache, because a person can hold a pose only so long before the muscles revolt. And when James reached for the mug with the chipped rim, the one Ryan had used as if he had earned the right, I felt the thin thread I had been walking for weeks sag under my weight. The house was silent in that overbright way that follows rain, and I decided in a slice of bravery that looked a lot like panic that hiding would not save either of us. So I told him we were expected at his parents' house for an early supper that had been upgraded to a celebration the moment they learned he might return. A word choice that made something mean flicker behind his eyes, since celebration is a loose garment you can drape over anything you do not want to examine. He said we could go if I felt up to it, and I said yes because I needed the stage and the audience and the worst lighting possible if I was going to turn the wheel that hard. Before we left, I did one small thing that was not small at all, and I did it with the calm of a person threading a needle over an open flame, because preparation is a form of apology when you do not have the words yet. And I opened the doorbell app that had been my quiet ally for longer than I care to admit, setting the camera to continuous record and linking the clip to a cloud folder labeled recipes. Then I sent a short message to Ryan that said, "Only we need to talk before dinner," phrased in the kind of neutral voice that men like him cannot resist, because they hear the promise of a private confession even when none is being offered. James did not ask why I lingered at the door, which was mercy I did not deserve, and we drove in a quiet that sounded like cotton stuffed in the ears, while in my pocket the phone hummed once to announce that the bait had been swallowed whole. Carol opened the door with a clutch of flowers that looked stolen from a neighbor's yard, and Frank patted James on the shoulder with that stiff pride men wear when they do not want to say they were worried. And there were casseroles on the counter with little labels, because control was always easier for them when starch was involved, and for a few minutes I almost believed we could float above the jagged ground if we kept everyone busy enough with plates and praise. Then Ryan arrived without knocking, loud with cologne and certainty, and he stepped into the kitchen with that proprietary slant of the shoulders, and when his eyes found me he smiled the private smile that had no right to exist. A small crooked thing that belonged to late nights and bad decisions, and the room snapped into focus so sharply I felt it in my teeth. He went for the performance he had been rehearsing, the one where he would play the misunderstood savior who kept me company while the noble brother served, but I moved first, and I asked him to help me carry a dish out to the porch. And the innocence of the request must have pleased his vanity because he followed without argument, and as soon as the screen door clicked shut he leaned too close and asked whether I had thought about how we might tell James, whether I wanted him to say he loved me first or whether I would rather say it. A grotesque little script he whispered with that stage whisper he uses when he thinks the spotlight loves him back. I repeated a single phrase I knew the microphone would catch, the one I had texted to set the trap, and I asked, calm as a judge, whether we were still on for telling him tonight like we planned, and Ryan, incapable of recognizing a cliff edge when it fits neatly into his shoe, said yes, said it was time, said James would get over it the way men always do when they face reality. And then he reached to touch my hair, and I stepped back, just far enough to make the porch light catch his face like a fingerprint. I did not slap him, and I did not scream, and I did not throw the dish, though all of those would have felt like modest fireworks. Instead, I opened my phone with my free hand, selected the live clip marked with a neat little timestamp, and forwarded it to 3 recipients with the steadiness of a surgeon. To Lauren, who had already packed her patients in a suitcase, to Carol, whose devotion to narrative had never met a fact it could not smother, and to James, who was inside with his father, debating whether the grill needed another minute, and then I watched the porch fill with the quiet after a detonation, the way sound goes thin and mean when truth finally enters the room. Ryan saw the motion but not the meaning. And he smiled again in that lopsided way until his phone vibrated, and then another phone inside the kitchen chimed, and then James's name appeared on my screen as a tiny delivered checkmark that felt more like a verdict than a receipt. He stepped out onto the porch a minute later with the careful expression of a man approaching an animal that might bolt or bite, and he held my eyes for a long time without speaking, a silence so heavy I could feel it moving air around my face. And I understood that what I had done was both defense and attack, a lifeline braided with a garrote. I told him I needed to talk before he heard anything from anyone else, because that was the only honest sentence left in the bowl, and I saw in his jaw the pulse of 1,000 miles and 1,000 nights. And I watched the understanding arrive like a slow train you can see for an hour before it pulls into the station. He nodded once, not agreement, but permission for the next breath, and from inside the house Carol called everyone to the table as though dinner could bind torn fabric, while Ryan tried to laugh, and found that the sound would not pass his teeth. James said we should sit down and hear it all at once, and though my knees went weak, I nodded, because the only way out of a maze that you built with your own hands is to draw your own map, and as we stepped back inside I could feel the tribunal taking shape around a casserole, with a family that loved the idea of forgiveness more than the work it requires. And I knew that before the night ended I would pour another measure of revenge, colder and sharper than the first, even if it sliced the hand that served it. The dining room smelled like baked cheese and anxious perfume, and the table glittered with the kind of cutlery that only appears when a family wants to prove it is still respectable. And we took our seats in that loose formation people use when they do not trust one another's hands, with Frank stationed at the head as a ceremonial referee, Carol arranging napkins with martial precision, Ryan sprawling into his chair like he owned patent rights to oxygen, and James beside me with his wrists resting on the edge of the table as if he were bracing against a sudden turn in heavy seas, while I set down my phone screen down because I had already arranged the only alarms I needed and could not afford to glance at them for reassurance. Carol launched the evening the way she runs everything, with an opening statement that sounded like a church bulletin mixed with a public relations memo, saying that families survive storms by refusing to anchor themselves to mistakes that young people do. Foolish things, and older people remember what matters, and that tonight we would eat, speak carefully, and decide, her favorite verb, how to move forward. And when she said those last words, her gaze touched James with a softness that resembled love until you noticed the calculation tucked into its corner. James asked for plain facts first, not as a judge or executioner, but as a man who had earned clarity the hard way, and I told him more than I wanted to hear out loud, choosing a path that did not spare me. Because if there was any chance for us to win a single inch of honest ground, it would be paved with sentences that left no room for euphemism, so I told him about the wine that dissolved my common sense like sugar in a kettle, about the way loneliness impersonates permission when you keep it fed, about the messages on the tablet that turned my stomach and my spine at the same time, and about the porch recording he had already received, and when I finished the room held its breath like a congregation caught between him and confession. Ryan reached for a script, the one where I was a damsel and he a rescuer victimized by chemistry, and he began to talk about fate as though it were a stray dog that had followed us home, but I cut him off before the word soulmate embarrassed the air. Because his prepared monologue wasn't the show tonight, and I turned to Carol and asked for her version, which turned out to be a careful braid of denial and optimism in which nothing ugly happened so long as no one named it, and in which forgiveness was not only a virtue but a binding contract already drafted in her head. I had come prepared for that version, not with shouting or plates hurled into corners, because crockery never convinces anyone, but with a folder of printouts and a sequence of calls scheduled like stepping stones across a fast river. So I slid the folder to the center of the table and invited anyone with courage to open it, and when no one moved I opened it myself and began to read, explaining calmly that 3 weeks after James shipped out someone used a very old power of attorney, one he had signed during a past training cycle for emergency bill pay and later revoked, to move funds from our joint account into a secondary account ending in digits everyone at the table recognized even if they pretended otherwise. And that on the same afternoon a cashier's check was cut for a truck down payment that never materialized as a truck but did transform quickly into cash after a private sale. And that the electronic authorization for those maneuvers had originated from a device associated with the home Wi-Fi at this very address, which meant the fairy tale about a burglar who understood banking law was going to have a very hard night. Carol tried to breathe an objection into life by waving at the notion of confusion, but right then my phone vibrated exactly once with the soft insistence of a train arriving on schedule, and I answered on speaker with an apology for the hour. And the woman from the credit union, whose patience I had rented with detailed notes and exact questions, introduced herself to the room by first and last name and title, and explained in that slow, patient diction institutions use when they have located both the breadcrumb trail and the baker that the revocation of the old document was on file and time-stamped, that the transfers had therefore been unauthorized, and that per the affidavit I had submitted that morning the funds were now frozen pending internal recovery, which meant the secondary account was, in non-technical terms, a block of ice that would not buy anyone a single gallon of gasoline. Ryan laughed the way men laugh when their bravado is sprinting ahead of their comprehension, a sound with too much air and not enough music, and he called it a misunderstanding we would straighten out in private, except the banker continued on gently, explaining that repeated login attempts from a device registered to his number had triggered fraud monitoring, and that, as a courtesy to a service member's household, the institution had flagged the profile for heightened verification, which was why a planned transfer earlier that afternoon had failed and would continue to fail, and Ryan's eyes flicked down to his phone at the exact moment Carol's did, because apparently both had tried that same neat end-of-day trick, and I watched the dawning recognition crawl across their faces like an unwelcome insect. Frank folded his hands and stared at the wood grain as if meaning would rise out of it if he watched long enough, and James did not move at all, but a tiny tremor traveled through his jaw and settled in the muscles near his temple, and I felt a guilt so large it had its own weather system while also feeling the hard satisfaction of moving a piece on a board where I had been pinned. Because revenge, if it is to be more than noise, must also protect the one person who still matters to you, I added the final measure I had saved for dessert, and I told Carol and Frank that the kindly neighbor they had enlisted to broker their wish for unity The same neighbor who had hinted strongly about James co-signing a tidy consolidation for family stability would not be able to execute any paperwork, since the credit check would now bounce off a new freeze on James's reports that I had placed with his written authorization on the drive over, a preventative gesture that kept predators and relatives equally at bay. And that any attempt to submit applications in his name would trigger alerts I had routed to a dedicated inbox that a friend from my office would monitor while I slept. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the sound of narratives collapsing, of future purchases evaporating, of a ladder kicked away from a rooftop plan, and Ryan finally broke it by muttering a string of half-sentences about loyalty and gratitude and the sacrifices he had made, at which point James turned his head slowly and asked him, in a voice low enough to respect the dead, exactly which sacrifice he wished to be thanked for. I should have stopped there, but momentum has its own hunger, and I pushed one more plate onto the table, a printout of messages between Carol and Ryan where she urged him to be present for me, to keep me company, to make sure I did not spiral. Phrased in the soft code of caretaking that would sound harmless to anyone who had not lived through its consequences, and I said I would not assign motives, only outcomes, and the outcome was that a woman who loved her husband had made a ruinous choice. Aided by a brother who wanted to be a king in a kingdom he did not build, and parents who preferred reputational hygiene to moral labor. Carol reached for my hand as if we could skip to absolution, and she asked, voice low, eyes bright, whether we might, for the sake of family, forgive and learn, and before I could answer the doorbell rang twice in a calm, deliberate rhythm. And every head turned toward the sound while my phone lit with a notification from the door camera and James rose from his chair without looking at anyone, and the episode ended in the frame of him walking down the hall toward whoever waited on the porch with the night pooling behind his shoulders like a curtain about to drop. The man at the door wore the bored professionalism of someone who knocks for a living and never gets invited to stay, and when James opened it the evening air leaned in with him, carrying the smell of damp hedges and a hint of lighter fluid from a neighbor's grill. And the visitor asked for Ryan by full name with the kind of neutrality that could pass for kindness if you hadn't learned to distrust tones that never change. And when Ryan materialized with his usual swagger, the stranger handed him a stiff envelope with a small bow of the wrist, as if presenting a prize, then turned and walked back down the path without requiring a single signature, which was its own kind of signature, because a process server does not need your permission to ruin your dinner. Inside the envelope sat a tidy stack of papers that had taken me 3 long afternoons and a sprint through my sanity to assemble, a sworn statement to the bank that fed a recovery demand, a notification from the credit union's fraud department that the account was frozen pending restitution, and, nestling on top like a cherry you did not order, a temporary civil order that kept Ryan at a polite distance from me, our house, and any device that knew our Wi-Fi password. All dressed in the court's indifferent typography that makes every life look exactly the same. Carol tried to laugh as if the whole event were a staged surprise for a reality show that rewards families for not reading the rules, and Frank muttered something about sorting this out like adults. A phrase that here meant making phone calls tomorrow to people who owed him favors when he was still important at the lodge, and James stood so still that I could hear the tiny tick of the second hand on the clock shaped like a ship's wheel. And in that long moment I understood that revenge is less about fireworks than about engineering, about turning off the gas supply before anyone notices the burners were ever lit, and while I do not pretend that serving Ryan a cold plate of legal consequences purged me of guilt, I will admit that a small corner of me savored his blinking confusion the way you savor the first mouthful of a complicated dessert you swore you were not hungry for. Ryan called me dramatic, which was hilarious given his taste for grand gestures and borrowed cologne, and he insisted that the papers were performative and would dissolve in daylight, and then his phone, loyal to the end, pinged with a new alert from his employer's compliance officer, who had apparently received, via the magic of anonymous tips, that coincidentally shared my writing style, the screenshots of him boasting about outplaying a deployed brother while moving money that did not belong to him, and I watched the color withdraw from his face like a tide that had just learned about the moon. I wish I could say I felt triumphant, that the choir in my chest stood and sang while he sputtered, but the truth is less glamorous, because victory without repair is just a better seat at a lonely table. So I turned to James and told him the part one had saved for last because it would hurt me more than it would embarrass them, and I said that the money the bank would recover, the portion they could claw back, plus whatever the civil court would insist on in monthly chunks, would not return to me in any way that glued us together, that instead I had already pledged it to a fund in his name that buys plane tickets for spouses who cannot afford to fly to homecomings, that pays overdue utility bills without asking for a speech, and that fills fridges in quiet kitchens where people are trying to keep the lights on while someone they love is counting sunsets far from home. And I said it with a calm I did not feel because if I blinked I might reconsider, and I did not trust myself around second chances when I had squandered the first. Carol accused me of theatrics, of parading generosity to win a prize I had not earned, and perhaps she was right in the way that mothers are sometimes right even when they are choosing the wrong hill. Yet the look James gave me was stranger and heavier than approval. A kind of sober acknowledgement that a person can be both the arsonist and the one who calls the fire department, and that sometimes remorse has to wear work boots. We did not finish dinner, because casseroles congeal when truth hits the table, and while Frank packed up awkward slices into containers as if he could Tetris the evening back into order, Ryan shuffled toward the door with the envelope tucked against his ribs, promising lawsuits and reconciliation in the same breath, which is a talent if you think about it, and Carol followed him with a flurry of whispered advice that sounded like stage directions for a play that had already closed. James and I stepped onto the porch where the damp air felt a degree kinder, and we stood without touching because we did not know if our hands would behave, and I told him, slowly and without flourishes, that I was moving out for a while, that I would take the quiet guest room at my coworker's place where the only voices were a pair of cheerful parakeets and the morning news, that I would see him in any room he chose with any third person present he named, counselor, chaplain, accountant, neighbor with good sense, that I would sign what needed signing and return what needed returning, and that I would not ask for forgiveness on a schedule designed to protect my feelings, because if we were to survive we would have to make time behave rather than trying to outrun it. He listened in that attentive way he has, the one that made me fall in love, because it made me feel like every word was a bead on a string he intended to keep, and when I finished he asked the only question that mattered, which was whether there was anything left in this marriage that had not been touched by either my poor choices or his brother's vanity, and I wanted to say yes with the enthusiasm of a game show contestant who hears a bell, but I told the harder version, that there were threads still clean, but they were thin, and they would not carry weight until we wove new cloth, and he nodded without promising anything, which was merciful because false hope is a diet of candy and air. Before I left, I performed one last piece of petty kindness disguised as a joke, because humor is a rope bridge over ravines I do not want to measure, and I placed the chipped mug in the freezer. An old trick my grandmother taught me for keeping men from using the wrong cup, and I taped a note inside the door that said in very plain words that the mug would stay there until we decided together what it meant to belong to a home, and if that sounds ridiculous, consider that people build altars out of less. I walked to the car with a single bag and a spine that felt both stronger and more exhausted than it had in years, and when I turned the key the porch light caught James in a square of dull gold like a character painted onto a theater backdrop. And my phone buzzed with 2 messages at once, one from the bank confirming the recovery process had started, and one from an unknown number that contained only a photo of the envelope crumpled in a trash can and the words "We're still family," as if declaring it could amend the ledger. I drove away without answering, and I left the ending open because sometimes the only honest ending is a doorway you do not walk through yet, and I will tell you that I do not know whether James will call tomorrow or next month or ever. But I do know that forgiveness is not a group project, and that if family wants to be a noun again instead of a weapon, it will have to earn its own quiet, and maybe that is the most infuriating revenge of all. The decision to stop performing loyalty and let the people who preached it figure out whether they ever meant it.